There is a night in human history that changed everything. A night that began in a garden and ended in a courtyard. A night of betrayal, denial, illegal trials, and a decision that would split time itself in two. The night before the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. Most people who know this story know the broad outline. Judas, a kiss, an arrest, Peter cutting off a soldier's ear, Pilate washing his hands. But the details, the specific, historically documented, archaeologically verified details of what happened in those 12 hours, tell a story that is far more extraordinary, far more legally complex, and far more humanly devastating than most people have ever been told. Tonight we are going to walk through that night hour by hour. We are going to look at what the Jewish law actually required for a capital trial, and why every single requirement was violated that night. We are going to examine the Roman political situation that made Pilate's decision the most agonizing of his career. We are going to look at what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane through the lens of modern medicine. And we are going to uncover the details that most people, even people who have read this story their entire lives, have never fully understood. Part 1. The Last Supper. What was actually happening the evening began in an upper room in Jerusalem. Jesus and his 12 disciples gathered for the Passover meal, the annual commemoration of the night God had delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt. But Jesus transformed this meal into something entirely new. The Passover Seder had a specific structure that every Jew present would have known by heart. 4 cups of wine, specific prayers, the recounting of the Exodus narrative, the eating of unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and the Passover lamb. Jesus used this familiar structure to reinterpret everything. The bread became his body. The 3rd cup, traditionally called the cup of redemption, became his blood of the new covenant. What most people miss is the 4th cup. In the traditional Passover Seder, there are 4 cups of wine corresponding to the 4 promises God made to Israel in Exodus 6. Jesus drank the 3rd cup and then said something extraordinary. He said he would not drink from the fruit of the vine until he drank it new in the kingdom
God
of
had delivered
God.
Israel
He
from
deliberately
slavery in
left the
Egypt,
4th
but
cup,
Jesus
the cup of
transformed this
completion,
meal into something
undrunk.
entirely
He was
new.
saying, in the symbolic language every person at the table would have understood, that the meal was not finished. It would be completed at the cross. John's Gospel records that at the Last Supper, Jesus also washed the feet of his disciples, a task so low that Jewish law specified it could not be required of a Jewish slave, only of a Gentile slave or a willing volunteer. The Creator of the universe, on the night before his execution, got on his knees and washed the feet of the men who would all abandon him within hours. This detail is so specific and so theologically strange that it could not have been invented. It can only be testimony. Part 2. The Garden of Gethsemane. What medicine tells us after the meal? Jesus led his disciples to an olive grove on the Mount of Olives called Gethsemane. The name means oil press. It was a place where olives were crushed to extract their oil. The symbolism was not accidental. What happened in that garden is one of the most medically remarkable descriptions in ancient literature. Luke, who was himself a physician, records that Jesus' sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. For centuries, skeptics dismissed this as poetic exaggeration. Then modern medicine provided a name for it. Hematidrosis is a rare but medically documented condition in which, under conditions of extreme psychological stress, the capillaries feeding the sweat glands rupture and mix blood with sweat. It has been documented in cases of extreme fear before execution, in combat situations, and in individuals facing overwhelming psychological pressure. Luke, the physician, described it accurately 19 centuries before it was formally classified in medical literature. The medical implications of hematidrosis are significant. The skin becomes extremely sensitive and fragile. This means that when Jesus was subsequently flogged, before he had even reached the cross, his skin was already in a compromised state. The suffering began in the garden, hours before the physical violence. In the garden, Jesus prayed 3 times for the cup to be taken from him. Biblical scholars note that the word cup here carries the same symbolic weight as the unfinished 4th cup of the Passover meal. He was asking if there was another way. And 3 times he concluded his prayer with the same phrase, "Not my will but yours," part 3. The arrest. The illegal beginning Judas Iscariot arrived in the garden with a detachment of Roman soldiers and officers from the chief priests. The word used in John's Gospel for the Roman detachment is spira, which refers to a cohort of anywhere from 200 to 600 soldiers. This was not a quiet arrest. This was a military operation. Peter drew a sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant, a man named Malchus. Jesus immediately stopped Peter, healed Malchus's ear, and submitted to arrest. This is one of the most carefully documented details in the Passion narrative. The servant's name, Malchus, is the kind of specific detail that gets included in testimony and excluded from legend. What followed was a series of legal proceedings so procedurally corrupt that Jewish legal scholars have studied them for centuries in disbelief. The Mishnah, the written codification of Jewish oral law, specified precise requirements for capital trials. A capital case could not be tried at night. A capital case could not begin and end on the same day. A verdict of guilty required 24 hours of deliberation. Witnesses had to be examined separately. The defendant had the right to present a defense. A guilty verdict required a majority of at least 2 in a court of 23 judges. Every single one of these requirements was violated in the trial of Jesus. The arrest happened at night. The initial hearing before the high priest Annas was held at night. The formal session of the Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish court, was convened before dawn. The entire process from arrest to conviction took a matter of hours. Witnesses contradicted each other. Jesus was struck during his testimony. The verdict was immediate. This was not a legal proceeding. It was a predetermined execution dressed in legal clothing, and the people conducting it knew it. The high priest Caiaphas had already determined the outcome weeks earlier, when he told the council that it was better for one man to die than for the nation to be destroyed. The trial was theater. The verdict was written before the proceedings began, Part 4, Pilate. The most agoning decision in Roman history by dawn. Jesus was before Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of Judea. And here the story enters one of its most psychologically complex chapters. Because Pilate did not want to execute Jesus, every source, Roman, Jewish, and Christian, agrees on this point. Pilate examined Jesus and found no basis for a charge. He sent him to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, who was in Jerusalem for Passover. Herod interrogated Jesus, received no response, mocked him, dressed him in royal robes, and sent him back. Pilate tried again to release him. He offered to release a prisoner, as was the custom during Passover, and gave the crowd the choice between Jesus and a man named Barabbas, who was imprisoned for insurrection and murder. The crowd chose Barabbas. Why? Political historians studying this period note that Barabbas represented something Jesus did not. Barabbas was a revolutionary. He had taken up arms against Rome. Many in Jerusalem wanted a Messiah who would fight, who would lead an armed rebellion and restore the kingdom of Israel by force. Jesus had refused to be that kind of Messiah. And in the crowd's calculus, a living revolutionary was more useful than a peaceful teacher under arrest. Pilate then had Jesus flogged, apparently hoping that a severe beating would satisfy the crowd and allow him to release Jesus without execution. The flogging itself, administered with the Roman flagellum, a whip with leather straps embedded with bone and metal, was severe enough to kill. Many condemned men died from flogging alone. Matthew records that Pilate's wife sent him a message during the trial. "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered greatly in a dream because of him." This is another specific detail, the kind that does not get invented. It is the kind that gets remembered because it was so unusual and so striking that the people present could not forget it. Finally, the crowd played their final card. They said that if Pilate released Jesus, he was no friend of Caesar. This was a political threat. It invoked the law of maiestas, treason, and it worked. Pilate ordered the execution. Then he washed his hands in front of the crowd and declared himself innocent of the blood of this man. He was trying to offload a responsibility he knew he was taking. Part 5. The night that changed everything in 12 hours. Jesus had been betrayed by a friend, abandoned by his closest companions, subjected to an illegal religious trial, denied 3 times by the person he had called the rock of his community, mocked by a local king, flogged within an inch of his life, and sentenced to death by a judge who publicly declared him innocent. Every element of that night was documented. Every element has been investigated, and every investigation arrives at the same conclusion: this was real. These were real people, real places, real legal proceedings, and a real execution. Historians from every background, Jewish, Roman, secular, and Christian, agree that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the Passover festival in approximately 30 or 33 AD. What they disagree about is what happened 3 days later. But to get to that question, you first have to understand what happened the night before, and now you do. Conclusion: the night before the crucifixion was the most legally corrupt, emotionally devastating, and historically consequential single night in human history. A man who had done nothing wrong was convicted by a court that had no legal authority to convict him, sentenced by a judge who believed he was innocent, and abandoned by every person who had promised to stand with him, and he let it happen. Not because he had no power to stop it, but because stopping it was never the plan. That night, the cup that had remained unfinished at the Passover table was finally, fully, and forever completed, and the world has never been the same since.